With so many customization options available, it can be really daunting to know where to begin building your first bot in Custom Robo. So I wanted to bring you guys this little build guide detailing like a kind of character archetype that I really like to use in Custom Robo Battle Revolution. And so this archetype, I like to call it the Little Blader. Basically, the idea is that you use a little raider in combination with the stabilizer legs and a gun that's got very little cooldown to allow yourself to like very safely pressure your opponent. And so the place to begin is actually with the legs. We use the stabilizer legs for the acceleration that it provides, and this is a really key component to this setup because you really need to be able to get to your max speed as quickly as possible after you shoot a little shot of your gun to remain as safe as possible. A lot of these parts you're going to see are interchangeable depending on the matchup, but the stabilizer leg is the one constant for the build. And so the next place to go is our gun. And so we're going to use the blade gun, hence Little Blader. And well, we use the blade gun because it's got one of the lowest amounts of end lag in the entire game. I'm not sure how it actually compares to like stun and knuckle, but I'm pretty sure it has the lowest cooldown in the game. And so for our robo, we're going to choose Peregrine. And the reason that we choose Peregrine with Blade as opposed to Shrike or Swift is because it's a little bit just easier to be able to combo Blade with our collision attack. And that's really important because without the ability to combo into collision attack, it's a whole lot harder to build damage on this thing. And so that's essentially the reason why Peregrine is paired with Blade. So for our bomb and pod, these are the less, I guess you would say the least like mandatory parts. But I want to show you what I found to be generally the most useful for me. So for our bomb, I choose Gemini P. The Gemini bomb shoots out 2 blasts that'll go to the right and to the left of your opponent. And that's just really nice because the blade hitbox fires straight forward. It's relatively small and it doesn't have any homing on it, really. So it can be easily avoided by like circle strafing around Peregrine. And Gemini P gives us an option to better deal with that because the left and right bombs will like catch your opponent if he's trying to strafe around. P is chosen here over Gemini B because basically it's got a nicer hitbox. Gemini P will explode on like the ground and have like a really compact round explosion, and you can jump over that. But Gemini P creates a pillar that's really tall, and that's better for locking down your opponent. It's just harder to avoid overall. And so for the pod, we're going to choose Spider G. Spider pods are really good with little raiders because of their high speed. It allows them to get around the stage very quickly and scatter a large number of pods at key locations in intersections between walls and things. And this is going to give you really good ground control. G is chosen over the regular spider because the difference really is in the knockback trajectory. G goes straight up and the regular spider is diagonally upwards. And so I just feel that G is a little bit more consistent. That's why we choose Spider G. So now I want to talk about some of the pros and cons of using this robo and kind of some general gameplay tips. So the philosophy when you're using this thing is going to be to run around and be mostly passive. You want to place your spiders at key locations on the battlefield, and you want to just once in a while poke your opponent with one little blade, and whether it hits them or not, it doesn't really matter that much, but because if you just fire one, you won't get punished. If you try to spam it, that's not going to work because that's easily punishable. But the idea is that you just poke at your opponent, and sometimes you hit him and sometimes you don't, but he can't really retaliate. And Peregrine is also really strong at being able to punish because of his high mobility. This build is really good at winning neutral consistently, as long as you're able to react and respond accordingly to what your opponent is doing, and it's really good at being able to nurse a lead. Once you get the lead versus your opponent, he's gonna have a really hard time catching you, as long as you're playing relatively passive and you're making good use of your pods. The place where it struggles is that it does not build damage very fast. I believe, I might be mistaken, but I believe that in this game the blade gun does 20 damage, which isn't a whole lot really. And so since it takes like time for the damage that you're building up to become significant, it means that it's harder to come back from behind whenever you are dealing with some time pressure. If your opponent can get a really strong hit on you in the last 10 seconds or something like that, or the last 30 seconds even, you're going to be hard pressed to come back from that. And generally it's got a really strong matchup spread, I would say. The strongest matchup, in my opinion, is by far Lightning Sky models, because once they jump and once they start flying around the stage, it's really easy for your little raider to avoid anything it can do while it's flying, and it's also really easy to get in position to punish his landing, which is extremely laggy. So I think this is definitely the best robo to choose if you are fighting a Lightning Sky. It's also pretty good versus metal grapplers. It's kind of a volatile matchup because they can trade much more efficiently than your little blader is going to be able to. However, they're going to have a hard time getting in versus you because of their mobility being so poor. The matchups we lose are kind of limited. I think honestly one of the worst matchups is the mirror match versus other little raiders, and that's because they're so fast that it's hard to actually hit them with a blade unless they do something that's extremely laggy. It's very easy for them to avoid our blade. The other difficulties we have are with like just general ground control options, such as spiders, which does help us win the little raider mirror match, by the way, the fact that we have spiders. Also, reflection pod is a real pain, and the hornet gun. Pretty much everything loses to the hornet gun in my opinion, except for maybe like some kind of build with homing star theoretically could do well, but little raiders in particular have trouble with the hornet gun because avoiding it is like being able to avoid hornets effectively means that you have to use the Z-axis because they fan out so wide. If you want to get around the hornets, you have to take a really wide arc around them, and it makes it extremely hard to approach if you need to do that. And so the main way to avoid them, if you aren't going to run around them, means having to jump, and little raiders have quite poor aerial mobility, and so that's why hornets are an especially big problem versus little raiders. Also, it really brings out the weakness that we have, being able to not really deal damage that fast because let's say in the last 30 seconds of the match, your opponent is able to get a close range hornet shot versus you. That's going to do about 300 damage, and it's really hard to come back from that if you get hit in that last little section of the game. However, we have some options available to us that make some matchups a little bit easier. The first one that I want to talk about is using the splash gun. Okay, so the splash gun has a little bit longer end lag than the blade gun does. It's not really easy to notice unless you're used to using the blade, but it does have longer cooldown. And it also has less range, which is why blade overall has a better matchup spread. However, the thing about splash gun is that it's got a really large hitbox, and it lingers on the field for a long amount of time, and that makes it easy to nail down opposing little raiders. However, when we use the splash gun, we need to make some modifications to the rest of our build to really maximize it. So the first thing is that we don't want to use Peregrine. The reason is that the knockdown trajectory for splash, if your opponent is already on the ground, if you hit them with the splash gun, it'll rise them vertically into the air. So we need to have a collision attack that can hit an airborne opponent and really capitalize off of that. And both Shrike and Swift are able to do this. However, Swift is generally going to be the preferred robo here, and the reason is that it's easier to combo splash into collision attack before the knockdown on Swift than it is with Shrike, because from about max splash range you can combo into Swift's collision attack and do your damage pretty well that way. With Shrike, his collision attack is pretty close range. It's like a Shoryuken basically. So if you're really particularly worried about having to anti-air or deal with opponents that want to approach you from the air, Shrike might be a better pick, but overall Swift is better with Splash Gun than Shrike is. And so from here, we want to change our bomb and pod as well. I like to use dual C on this setup because Splash Gun doesn't have very much range like I mentioned before, so we need a bomb that's able to pressure from a distance, and dual C gives us that. It puts 2 explosions on the ground whenever it blows up. It like kind of blows up and then it blows up behind the initial explosion, which allows it to clear walls kind of, and that's really nice because it's always a pain having to approach someone who's hiding behind a wall. And C is chosen over regular dual bomb, even though it deals less damage. The reason for that is that it's got more hit stun. Actually, it's got quite significantly more hit stun, and that does 2 things for us. For one thing, it gives us an easier time being able to follow up our bomb into some type of combo. Since we're generally speaking going to be shooting this from a longer range, it's going to be hard to actually combo off of our bomb because we're just not going to be in position to make that happen. However, it's still really useful to have the extra hit stun because having increased frame advantage means that we have more time to close the gap between us and our opponent and work ourselves into a range where Splash Gun is going to be more threatening to them. And so for our pod, Spider definitely still works actually. However, I like to change to Cockroach H on this build. It works similarly to Spider in that whenever they get close, it'll like home in on them and go really fast. However, Cockroach H, unlike Spider, it'll move forward slowly even whenever it's not homing, and this aids us in our approach. And Swift well, not just swift, but because we're using the splash gun, I guess I should say, we're pressured more to approach because we cannot hit the opponent from full screen. So that's why I choose Cockroach H. Well, again, H is used over G because of the added hit stun, which is more meaningful at the ranges where you're going to be wanting to use your pod, because you can actually follow up. And so generally, I think that this setup with Splash doesn't have as strong of a matchup spread as the Blade variant does. However, it deals with opposing Little Raiders a whole lot better, which is the main reason why you would select this. There's some more options you have as well for your bomb and pod, because Splash Gun is really effective at doing vertical combos. If you want to use Smash Bomb, or if you would like to use Umbrella Pod, those can combo really nicely with Splash Gun. However, you give up a tool you have to give up one of your tools that's effective in neutral to be able to do that. And I think that a lot of times it's just not worth it. However, if one of your opponent's robos is something that's going to be in the air a lot and you really want the anti-air, then it's a really nice option to be able to throw on this build because you get more combo opportunity off of it. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of variations on the Little Blader is using Shrike with Needle. And I already mentioned that Shrike can work with Splash Gun if you need the anti-air and you feel that that's valuable to you. But Shrike with Needle feels a very special niche, which is that it deals with like air stalling. So if your opponent wants to just hang out in the sky outside of your splash range, you can use the Needle Gun to still be able to hit them. And Shrike is really good for doing this because his Shoryuken is like, his collision is ground to air, and then it makes you actionable again while you're airborne. So if you read your opponent to shoot his gun at you, you can soak up the hit with your collision attack and then punish with Needle. And this can be more useful for taking out airborne opponents because with what's that called? Acrobat Bomb plus the Feather Legs, you're able to go so ridiculously, like comically high in the air that you actually outrange the Splash Gun even at the max height of his Shoryuken. And so that's why you have to use Needle versus that. Since it's got a similar kind of hitbox to Blade, then I would recommend going back to Gemini P and Spider G for this build, with of course Stabilizer being the constant. And the last thing that I want to talk about when using Little Bladers is stage selection, which is kind of a difficult thing to talk about really because there's not a universally agreed upon stage list, but there are a lot of stages that we do agree on. The general rule of thumb is that you want to have like pretty open stage that gives you a lot of room to run around without like having too many walls to get in your way. So L formation is a really fantastic stage to go to, and so also is practice stage. Now if you have the opportunity to choose between basic arena and practice stage, always go with the practice stage here, because the 2 additional walls in basic arena really do make a quite significant difference in terms of like hindering your ability to poke your opponent because the walls just get in the way. Now stages that you want to stay away from, obviously anything that hinders ground movement, such as like lava or treadmills or ice, obviously, but the other thing that you want to avoid is stages like Crevice Court. I think Crevice Court would be one of the first ones that you choose to ban if you want to use this, and that's because not only does it have like a lot of walls that really clutter up the center of the stage, but the indents in the walls, the like cutout sections that you can shoot through on Crevice Court. Other robos, most other robos anyway, can actually walk over those without jumping, but little raiders, since their legs are so small, if they try to run over those walls, they just run into them and stop moving as if they ran into a regular wall. And it's kind of comical to look at, actually, but it gives us a pretty big disadvantage that other robos don't have. So stay away from Crevice Court, definitely. Another one that I don't think anybody uses this stage, but I would just want to throw it out there, is Battle Gear Station. Don't go to that stage. That stage is awful for little raiders. But I don't want to delve too deeply into why, just because most people don't use it. This video has gone on a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I think that I've covered everything I need to. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to see more Custom Robo content in the future. And until next time, guys, peace.